United Nations urges the planet to kick the carbon habit. Our world is in the grip of a very serious and dangerous carbon habit. We may already be at the point of no return, or the tipping point, where the emissions in the atmosphere will carry on, contributing to climate change or global warming faster and faster. The world must find the collective purpose to combat climate change and global warming. Unless everyone on this planet takes their responsibility seriously, we will simply not be able to make a difference. Global carbon emissions from burning fossil fuels are rising quickly, and scientists predict rising seas, melting glaciers, and more intense storms, droughts, and floods as the planet warms. A summit of G8 nations in Japan next month is due to formalize a goal agreed a year ago that global carbon emissions should be reduced by at least 50% below 1990 levels by 2050. But some nations want a reduction of 80% of carbon emissions by 2050 to try or in an attempt to stabilize CO2 concentrations in the air to limit global warming and climate change. Australian Prime Minister Kevin Rudd has said climate change was already a reality. He said, "We have been experiencing the worst drought in living memory, and our inland rivers are running dry. We are committed to reducing greenhouse gas emissions by at least 60% on 2000 levels by 2050. We will implement emissions trading as the primary mechanism for achieving this target," he said in a statement. Top industrial nations have stopped short of making firm commitments for a midterm goal for 2020, which many countries argue is very crucial to saving the planet from an environmental crisis or massive global extinction. Climate scientists and researchers have urged rich countries to reduce emissions by between 25% and 40% by 2020 to avoid the worst effects of global warming. Even as small as a 3.6 degree Fahrenheit temperature rise could subject up to 2 billion people or more to water shortages by 2050 or before, and threaten extinction for at least 20% to 30% or more of the world's species, according to a 2007 report by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the United Nations network of 2,000 scientists. The panel's fourth climate change assessment has reported that we have less than 5 to 7 years to take action if rising temperatures are to be limited to no more than 4 degrees Fahrenheit. Could be even more, as many as 5 or more. This must be done in the next few years, and we have to bring about a reduction in emissions of greenhouse gases worldwide. And the earlier we can start, the better. $45 trillion needed to fight warming. Our 45 trillion revolution to fight global warming, climate change. The International Energy Agency has said oil use and CO2 gases clearly not sustainable. The world needs to invest at least $45 trillion in energy in the next few coming decades, building at least 1,400 nuclear power plants and vastly expanding wind power and solar power, just in order to cut greenhouse gas emissions in half by 2050 or before, according to a new energy study released Friday. The report by the Paris-based International Energy Agency envisions an energy revolution that would greatly reduce the world's dependence on fossil fuels. Meeting this target of 50% cut in emissions represents a very formidable challenge, and we would require immediate policy action and technological transition on an unprecedented scale. The IEA Executive Director said, the United Nations network of scientists concluded last year that emissions have to be cut by at least half by 2050 or before to avoid an increase in world temperatures of at least 3.6 and 4.2 degrees above pre-18th century levels. Researchers, scientists say temperature increases beyond that could trigger totally devastating effects, such as widespread loss of species, more extreme famines, and devastating droughts, and swamping of heavily populated coastal areas by rapidly rising oceans. Environment ministers from the Group of 8 industrialized countries and Russia backed the 50% target in a meeting in Japan last month and called for it to be officially endorsed at the G8 summit in July. The IEA report has mapped out two main scenarios, one in which emissions are reduced to 2005 levels by 2050 or before, and a second that would bring them to just half of 2005 levels by mid-century or before. In other words, in the next few decades. We got to get to work on this really quick. This is really serious. The scenario for deeper cuts would require massive investment in energy technology development and deployment, a far and wide-ranging campaign to dramatically increase energy efficiency, and a total wholesale shift to renewable sources of energy. Governments and the private sector would have to make at least an additional investment of $45 trillion in energy, or approximately 1.1% of the world's gross domestic product, the report said. That would be an investment more than 3 times the current size of the entire U.S. economy. The second scenario also calls for an accelerated ramping up of development of so-called carbon capture and storage technology, allowing coal-powered power plants to catch emissions and inject them underground. Yes, CO2 increase is not sustainable, and these are more signs of the end times, transition days.